Chapter 11 of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 11. Vegetarianism in the Drawing Room. The company that assembled to listen to the Prophet of the Moon on the next occasion of his delivering any formal address was much more select than the comparatively mixed and middle-class society of the Simple Souls. Miss Browning and her sister, Mrs. Mackintosh, were indeed present, for Lord Ivywood had practically engaged them both as private secretaries, and kept them pretty busy, too. There was also Mr. Leveson, because Lord Ivywood believed in his organizing power, and also Mr. Hibbs, because Mr. Leveson believed in his political judgment, whenever he could discover what it was. Mr. Leveson had straight, dark hair and looked nervous. Mr. Hibbs had straight, fair hair and also looked nervous. But the rest of the company were more of Ivywood's own world, or the world of high finance with which it mixes both here and on the continent. Lord Ivywood welcomed, with something approaching to warmth, a distinguished foreign diplomatist, who was indeed none other than the silent German representative who had sat beside him in that last conference on the Island of the Olives. Dr. Gluck was no longer in his quiet black suit, but wore an ornate diplomatic uniform with a sword and Prussian, Austrian, or Turkish orders, for he was going on from Ivywood to a function at court. But his curl of red lips, his screw of black mustache, and his unanswering almond eyes had no more changed than the face of a wax figure in a barber's shop window. The Prophet had also effected an improvement in his dress. When he had orated on the sands, his costume, except for the fez, was the shabby but respectable costume of any rather unsuccessful English clerk. But now that he had come among aristocrats who petted their souls as they did their senses, there must be no such incongruity. He must be a proper, fresh-picked oriental tulip or lotus. So, he wore long, flowing robes of white, relieved here and there by flame-colored threads of tracery, and round his head was a turban of a kind of pale golden green. He had to look as if he had come flying across Europe on the magic carpet, or fallen a moment before from his paradise in the moon. The ladies of Lord Ivywood's world were much as we have already found them. Lady Enid Wimpole still overwhelmed her earnest and timid face with a tremendous costume that was more like a procession than a dress. It looked rather like the funeral procession of Aubrey Beardsley. Lady Joan Brett still looked like a very beautiful Spaniard with no illusions left about her castle in Spain. The large and resolute lady who had refused to ask any questions at Misysra's earlier lecture, and who was known as Lady Crump, the distinguished feminist, still had the air of being so full and bursting with questions fatal to man as to have passed the speaking and reached the speechless stage of hostility. Throughout the proceedings she contributed nothing but bursting silence and a malevolent eye. And old Lady Ivywood, under the oldest and finest lace and the oldest and finest manners, had a look like death on her, which can often be seen in the parents of pure intellectuals. She had that face of a lost mother that is more pathetic than the face of a lost child. "And what are you going to delight us with today?" Lady Enid was asking of the Prophet. "My lecture," answered Misysra gravely, "is on the pig." It was part of a simplicity really respectable in him that he never saw any incongruity in the arbitrary and isolated texts or symbols out of which he spun his thousand insane theories. Lady Enid endured the impact of this singular subject for debate without losing that expression of wistful sweetness which she wore on principle when talking to such people. "The pig, he is a large subject," continued the Prophet, making curves in the air as if embracing some particularly prized specimen. "He includes many subjects. It is to me very strange that the Christians should so laugh and be surprised because we hold ourselves to be defiled by pork, we and also another of the peoples of the book. But surely you Christians yourselves consider the pig as a manner of pollution, since it is your most usual expression of your despising, of your very great dislike. You say swine, my dear lady. You do not say animals far more unpopular, such as the alligator. I see, said the lady. How wonderful! If you are annoyed, went on the encouraged and excited gentleman, if you are annoyed with anyone, with what you say, a lady's maid, you do not say to her, horse. You do not say to her, camel. Ah, no, said Lady Enid earnestly. Pig of a lady's maid, you say in your colloquial English, continued the prophet triumphantly. And yet, this great and awful pig, this monster whose very name, when whispered, you think will wither all your enemies, you allow, my dear lady, to approach yet closer to you. You incorporate this great pig in the substance of your own person. Lady Enid Wimpole was looking a little dazed at last, at this description of her habits, and Joan gave Lord Ivywood a hint that the lecturer had better be transferred to his legitimate sphere of lecturing. Ivywood led the way into a larger room that was full of ranked chairs, with a sort of lectern at the other end, and flanked on all four sides with tables laden with all kinds of refreshments. It was typical of the strange, half-fictitious enthusiasm and curiosity of that world that one long table was set out entirely with vegetarian foods, especially of an Eastern sort, like a table spread in the desert for a rather fastidious Indian hermit; but that tables covered with game patties, lobster and champagne were equally provided, and very much more frequented. Even Mr. Hibbs, who would honestly have thought entering a public house more disgraceful than entering a brothel, could not connect any conception of disgrace with Lord Ivywood's champagne. For the purpose of the lecture was not wholly devoted to the great and awful pig, and the purpose of the meeting even less. Lord Ivywood, the white furnace of whose mind was always full of new fancies hardening into ambitions, wanted to have a debate on the diet of East and West, and felt that Miss Istra might very appropriately open with an account of the Moslem veto on pork or other coarse forms of flesh food. He reserved it to himself to speak second. The prophet began, indeed, with some of his dizziest flights. He informed the company that they, the English, had always gone in hidden terror and loathing of the pig as a sacred symbol of evil. He proved it by the common English custom of drawing a pig with one's eyes shut. Lady Joan smiled, and yet she asked herself, in a doubt that had been darkening round her about many modern things lately, whether it was really much more fanciful than many things the scientists told her, as the traces of marriage by capture which they found in that ornamental and even frivolous being, the best man. He said that the dawn of greater enlightenment is shown in the use of the word gammon, which still expresses disgust at the porcine image, but no longer fear of it, but rather a rational disdain and disbelief. Rowley, said the prophet solemnly, and then after a long pause, holy gammon and spinach. Lady Joan smiled again, but again asked herself if it was much more far-fetched than a history book she had read, which proved the unpopularity of Catholicism in Tudor times from the word hocus pocus. He got into a most amazing labyrinth of philology between the red primeval sins of the first pages of Genesis and the common English word ham. But again Joan wondered whether it was much wilder than the other things she had heard said about primitive man by people who had never seen him. He suggested that the Irish were set to keep pigs because they were a low and defiled caste, and the serfs of the pig-scorning Saxon. And Joan thought it was about as sensible as what the dear old Archdeacon had said about Ireland years ago, which had caused an Irishman of her acquaintance to play the Shan Van Voght and then smash the piano. Joan Brett had been thoughtful for the last few days, It was partly due to the scene in the turret, where she had struck a sensitive and artistic side of Philip Ivywood she had never seen before, and partly to disturbing news of her mother's health, which, though not menacing, made her feel hypothetically how isolated she was in the world. On all previous occasions she had merely enjoyed the mad lecturer now at the reading desk. Today she felt a strange desire to analyze him, and imagine how a man could be so connected and so convinced and yet so wildly wide of the mark. As she listened carefully, looking at the hands in her lap, she began to think she understood. The lecturer did really try to prove that the porcine image had never been used in English history or literature except in contempt. And the lecturer really did know a very great deal about English history and literature, much more than she did, much more than the aristocrats round her did. But she noticed that in every case what he knew was a fragmentary fact. In every case what he did not know was the truth behind the fact. What he did not know was the atmosphere. What he did not know was the tradition. She found herself ticking off the cases like counts in an indictment. Misysra Ammon knew, what next to none of the English present knew, that Richard III was called a bore by an 18th century poet and a hog by a 15th century poet. What he did not know was the habit of sport and of heraldry. He did not know, what Joan knew instantly, though she had never thought of it before in her life, that beasts courageous and hard to kill are noble beasts, by the law of chivalry. Therefore the boar was a noble beast, and a common crest for great captains. Misysra tried to show that Richard had only been called a pig after he was cold pork at Bosworth. Misysra Ammon knew, what next to none of the English present knew, that there never was such a person as Lord Bacon. The phrase is a falsification of what should be Lord Verulam or Lord St. Albans. What he did not know was exactly what Joan did know, though it had never crossed her mind till that moment, that when all is said and done, a title is a sort of joke, while a surname is a serious thing. Bacon was a gentleman, and his name was Bacon, whatever titles he took. But Misysra seriously tried to prove that Bacon was a term of abuse applied to him during his unpopularity or after his fall. Misysra Ammon knew, what next to none of the English present knew, that the poet Shelley had a friend called Hogg, who treated him on one occasion with grave treachery. He instantly tried to prove that the man was only called Hogg because he had treated Shelley with grave treachery. And he actually adduced the fact that another poet, practically contemporary, was called Hogg as completing the connection with Shelley. What he did not know was just what Joan had always known without knowing it, the kind of people concerned, the traditions of aristocrats like the Shelleys or of borderers like the Ettrick Shepherd. The lecturer concluded with a passage of impenetrable darkness about pig iron and pigs of lead, which Joan did not even venture to understand. She could only say that if it did not mean that some day our diet might become so refined that we ate lead and iron, she could form no fancy of what it did mean. "Can Philip Ivywood believe this kind of thing?" she asked herself, and even as she did so Philip Ivywood rose. He had, as Pitt and Gladstone had, an impromptu classicism of diction, his words wheeling and deploying into their proper places like a well-disciplined army in its swiftest advance. And it was not long before Joan perceived that the last phase of the picture, obscure and monstrous as it seemed, gave Ivywood exactly the opening he wanted. Indeed, she felt, no doubt, that he had arranged for it beforehand. "It is within my memory," said Lord Ivywood, "though it need in no case have encumbered yours, that when it was my duty to precede the admired lecturer whom I now feel it a privilege even to follow, I submitted a suggestion which, however simple, would appear to many paradoxical. I affirmed or implied the view that the religion of Mahomet was, in a peculiar sense, a religion of progress. This is so contrary, not only to historical convention, but to common platitude, that I shall find no ground either of surprise or censure if it takes a perceptible time before it sinks into the mind of the English public. But I think, ladies and gentlemen, that this period is notably abbreviated by the remarkable exposition which we have heard today. For this question of the attitude of Islam toward food affords as excellent an example of its special mode of progressive purification as the more popular example of its attitude toward drink. For it illustrates that principle which I have ventured to call the principle of the crescent, the principle of perpetual growth toward an implied and infinite perfection. The great religion of Islam does not of itself forbid the eating of flesh foods, but, in accordance with that principle of growth which is its life, it has pointed the way to a perfection not yet perhaps fully attainable by our nature. It has taken a plain and strong example of the dangers of meat eating, and hung up the repellent carcass as a warning and a sign. In the gradual emergence of mankind from a gross and sanguinary mode of sustenance, the Semite has led the way. He has laid, as it were, a symbolic embargo upon the beast typical, the beast of beasts. With the instinct of the true mystic, he selected for exemption from such cannibal feasts the creature which appeals to both sides of the higher vegetarian ethic. The pig is at once the creature whose helplessness most moves our pity, and whose ugliness most repels our taste. It would be foolish to affirm that no difficulty arises out of the different stages of moral evolution in which the different races find themselves. Thus it is constantly said, and such things are not said without some excuse in document or incident, that followers of the Prophet have specialized in the arts of war and have come into a contact, not invariably friendly, with those Hindus of India who have specialized in the arts of peace. In the same way, the Hindus, it must be confessed, have been almost as much in advance of Islam in the question of meat as Islam is in advance of Christianity in the matter of drink. It must be remembered again and again, ladies and gentlemen, that every allegation we have of any difference between Hindu and Moslem comes through a Christian channel, and is therefore tainted evidence. But in this matter, even, can we not see the perils of disregarding such plain danger signals as the veto on pork? Did not an empire nearly slip out of our hands because our hands were greased with cow fat? And did not the well of Cawnpore brim with blood instead of water because we would not listen to the instinct of the Oriental about the shedding of sacred blood? But if it be proposed, with whatever graduation, to approach that repudiation of flesh food which Buddhism mainly and Islam partly recommends, it will always be asked by those who hate the very vision of progress, "Where do you draw the line? May I eat oysters? May I eat eggs? May I drink milk?" You may. You may eat or drink anything essential to your stage of evolution, so long as you are evolving toward a clearer and cleaner ideal of bodily life. If, he said gravely, I may employ a phrase of flippancy, I would say that you may eat 6 dozen oysters today, but I should strongly advise 5 dozen oysters tomorrow. For how else has all progress in public or private manners been achieved? Would not the primitive cannibals be surprised at the strange distinction we draw between men and beasts? All historians pay high honor to the Huguenots and the great Huguenot prince, Henri Quatre. None need deny that his aspiration that every Frenchman should have a chicken in his pot was, for the period, a high aspiration. It is no disrespect to him that we, mounting to higher levels, and looking down longer perspectives, consider the chicken. And this august march of discovery passes figures higher than that of Henry of Navarre. I shall always have a high place, as Islam has always given a high place, to that figure, mythical or no, which we find presiding over the foundations of Christianity. I cannot doubt that the fable, incredible and revolting otherwise, which records the rush of swine into the sea, was an allegory of his early realization that a spirit, evil indeed, does reside in all animals in so far as they tempt us to devour them. I cannot doubt that the prodigal leaving his sins among the swine is another illustration of the great thesis of the Prophet of the Moon. But here also progress and relativity are relentless in their advance, and not a few of us may have risen today to the point of regretting that the joyful sounds around the return of the prodigal should be marred by the moaning of a calf. For the rest, he who asks us whither we go knows not the meaning of progress. If we come at last to live on light, as men said of the chameleon, if some cosmic magic closed to us now as radium was but recently closed, allows us to transmute the very metals into flesh without breaking into the bloody house of life, we shall know these things when we have achieved them. It is enough for us now if we have achieved a spiritual station, in which at least the living head we lop has not eyes to reproach us, and the herbs we gather cannot cry against our cruelty like the mandrake. Lord Ivywood resumed his seat, his colourless lips still moving. By some previous arrangement, probably, Mr. Leveson rose to move a motion about vegetarianism. Mr. Leveson was of opinion that the Jewish and Moslem veto on pork had been the origin of vegetarianism. He thought it was a great step, and showed how progressive the creed could be. He thought the persecution of the Hindus by Moslems had probably been much exaggerated. He thought our experience in the Indian Mutiny showed we considered the feeling of Easterners too little in such matters. He thought vegetarianism in some ways an advance on orthodox Christianity. He thought we must be ready for yet further advances, and he sat down. And as he had said precisely, clause by clause, everything that Lord Ivywood had said, it is needless to say that that nobleman afterward congratulated him on the boldness and originality of his brilliant speech. At a similar sort of preconcerted signal, Hibbs, however, rose rather vaguely to his feet to second the motion. He rather prided himself on being a man of few words in the vocal sense. He was no orator, as Brutus was. It was only with pen in hand, in an office lined with works of reference, that he could feel that sense of confused responsibility that was the one pleasure of his life. But on this occasion he was brighter than usual, partly because he liked being in a lord's house, partly because he had never tasted champagne before, and he felt as if it agreed with him, partly because he saw in the subject of progress an infinite opportunity of splitting hairs. "Whatever," said Hibbs, with a solemn cough, "whatever we may think of the old belief that Moslems have differed from Buddhism in a regrettable way, there can be no doubt the responsibility lay with the Christian churches. Had the free churches put their foot down and met Messrs. Opalstein's demand, we should have heard nothing of these old differences between one belief and another." As it was, it reminded him of Napoleon. He gave his own opinion for what it was worth, but he was not afraid to say at any cost, even there and in that company, that this business of Asiatic vegetation had occupied less of the time of the Wesleyan Conference than it should have done. He would be the last to say, of course, that anyone was in any sense to blame. They all knew Dr. Kuhn's qualifications. They all knew as well as he did that a more strenuous social worker than Charles Chatter had never rallied the forces of progress. But that which was not really an indiscretion might be represented as an indiscretion, and perhaps we had had enough of that just lately. It was all very well to talk about coffee, but it should be remembered, with no disrespect to those in Canada to whom we owe so much, that all that happened before 1891. No one had less desire to offend our ritualistic friends than he did, but he had no hesitation in saying that the question was a question that could be asked, and though no doubt, from one point of view the goats... Lady Joan moved sharply in her chair as if gripped by sudden pain, and indeed she had suddenly felt the chronic and recurrent pain of her life. She was brave about bodily pain, as are most women, even luxurious women. But the torment that from time to time returned and tore her was one to which many philosophical names have been given, but no name so philosophical as boredom. She felt she could not stand a minute more of Mr. Hibbs. She felt she would die if she heard about the goats, from one or any point of view. She slipped from her chair and somehow slid round the corner in pretense of seeking one of the tables of refreshment in the new wing. She was soon among the new Oriental apartments, now almost completed. But she took no refreshments, though attenuated tables could still be found here and there. She threw herself on an ottoman and stared toward the empty and elfin turret chamber, in which Ivywood had made her understand that he, also, could thirst for beauty and desire to be at peace. He certainly had a poetry of his own, after all, a poetry that never touched earth, the poetry of Shelley rather than Shakespeare. His phrase about the fairy turret was true. It did look like the end of the world. It did seem to teach her that there is always some serene limit at last. She started and half rose on her elbow with a small laugh. A dog of ludicrous but familiar appearance came shuffling toward her, and she lifted herself in the act of lifting him. She also lifted her head and saw something that seemed to her, in a sense more Christian and catastrophic, very like the end of the world. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 12. Vegetarianism in the Forest. Humphrey Pump's cooking of a fungus in an old frying pan, which he had found on the beach, was extremely typical of him. He was, indeed, without any pretense of book learning, a certain kind of scientific man that science has really been unfortunate in losing. He was the old-fashioned English naturalist, like Gilbert White or even Isaac Walton, who learned things not academically like an American professor, but actually like an American Indian. And every truth a man has found out as a man of science is always subtly different from any truth he has found out as a man, because a man's family, friends, habits, and social type have always got well under way before he has thoroughly learned the theory of anything. For instance, any eminent botanist at a soiree of the Royal Society could tell you, of course, that other edible fungi exist, as well as mushrooms and truffles. But long before he was a botanist, still less an eminent botanist, he had begun, so to speak, on a basis of mushrooms and truffles. He felt, in a vague way, that these were really edible, that mushrooms were a moderate luxury proper to the middle classes, while truffles were a much more expensive luxury, more suitable to the smart set. But the old English naturalists, of whom Isaac Walton was perhaps the first, and Humphrey Pump perhaps the last, had in many cases really begun at the other end, and found by experience, often most disastrous experience, that some fungi are wholesome and some are not, but the wholesome ones are, on the whole, the majority. So a man like Pump was no more afraid of a fungus as such than he was of an animal as such. He no more started with the supposition that a gray or purple growth on a stone must be a poisonous growth than he started with the supposition that a dog who came to him out of the wood must be a mad dog. Most of them he knew. Those he did not know he treated with rational caution, but to him, as a whole race, these weird-hued and one-legged goblins of the forests were creatures friendly to man. "You see," he said to his friend the captain, "eating vegetables isn't half bad, so long as you know what vegetables there are, and eat all of them that you can. But there are two ways where it goes wrong among the gentry. First, they've never had to eat a carrot or a potato because it was all there was in the house. So they've never learned how to be really hungry for carrots, as that donkey might be. They only know the vegetables that are meant to help the meat. They know you take duck and peas, and when they turn vegetarian they can only think of the peas without the duck. They know you take lobster in a salad, and when they turn vegetarian they can only think of the salad without the lobster. But the other reason is worse. There's plenty of good people even round here, and still more in the north, who get meat very seldom. But then, when they do get it, they gobble it up like good 'uns. But the trouble with the gentry is different. The trouble is, the same sort of gentry that don't want to eat meat don't really want to eat anything. The man called a vegetarian who goes to Ivywood House is generally like a cow trying to live on a blade of grass a day. You and I, Captain, have pretty well been vegetarians for some time, so as not to break into the cheese, and we haven't found it so difficult because we eat as much as we can. It's not so difficult as being teetotalers, answered Dalroy, so as not to break into the cask. But I'll never deny that I feel the better for that too, on the whole. But only because I could leave off being one whenever I chose. And, now I come to think of it, he cried, with one of his odd returns of animal energy, if I'm to be a vegetarian, why shouldn't I drink? Why shouldn't I have a purely vegetarian drink? Why shouldn't I take vegetables in their highest form, so to speak? The modest vegetarians ought obviously to stick to wine or beer, plain vegetarian drinks, instead of filling their goblets with the blood of bulls and elephants, as all conventional meat-eaters do, I suppose. What is the matter?" "Nothing," answered Pump. "I was looking out for somebody who generally turns up about this time, but I think I'm fast." "I should never have thought so from the look of you," answered the captain, "but what I'm saying is that the drinking of decent fermented liquor is just simply the triumph of vegetarianism. Why, it's an inspiring idea. I could write a sort of song about it, as, for instance, you will find me drinking rum like a sailor in a slum, you will find me drinking beer like a Bavarian, you will find me drinking gin in the lowest kind of inn, because I am a rigid vegetarian. Why, it's a vista of verbal felicity and spiritual edification. It has I not know how many hundred aspects. Let's see, how could the second verse go? Something like, so I cleared the inn of wine, and I tried to climb the sign, and I tried to hail the constable as Marion, but he said I couldn't speak, and he bowled me to the beak, because I was a happy vegetarian. I really think something instructive to the human race may come out of all this. Hullo, is that what you're looking for?" The quadruped Quoodle came in out of the woods a whole minute later than the usual time and took his seat beside Humphrey's left foot with a preoccupied air. "Good old boy," said the captain. "You seem to have taken quite a fancy to us. I doubt, Hump, if he's properly looked after up at the house. I particularly don't want to talk against Ivywood, Hump. I don't want his soul to be able, in all eternity, to accuse my soul of a mean detraction. I want to be fair to him because I hate him like hell, and he has taken from me all for which I lived. But I don't think, with all this in my mind, I don't think I say anything beyond what he would own himself, for his brain is clear, when I say that he could never understand an animal. And so he could never understand the animal side of a man. He doesn't know to this day, Hump, that your sight and hearing are 60 times quicker than his. He doesn't know that I have a better circulation. That explains the extraordinary people he picks up and acts with. He never looks at them as you and I look at that dog. There was a fellow calling himself Gluck, who was, mainly by Ivywood's influence, I believe, his colleague on the Turkish conferences, being supposed to represent Germany. My dear Hump, he was a man that a great gentleman like Ivywood ought not to have touched with a barge pole. It's not the race he was, if it was one race, it's the sort he was, a coarse, common, Levantine nark and eavesdropper. But you mustn't lose your temper, Hump. I implore you, Hump, to control this tendency to lose your temper when talking at any length about such people. Have recourse, Hump, to that consoling system of versification which I have already explained to you. Oh, I knew a Dr. Gluck, and his nose it had a hook, and his attitudes were anything but Aryan. So I gave him all the pork that I had upon a fork, because I am myself a vegetarian. If you are, said Humphrey Pump, you'd better come and eat some vegetables. The white hat can be eaten cold, or raw for that matter, but blood spots want some cooking. You are right, Hump, said Dalroy, seating himself with every appearance of speechless greed. I will be silent. As the poet says, I am silent in the club, I am silent in the pub, I am silent on a bally peak in Darien, for I stuff away for life, shoving peas in with a knife, because I am at heart a vegetarian. He fell to his food with great gusto, dispatched a good deal of it in a very short time, threw a glance of gloomy envy at the cask, and then sprang to his feet again. He caught up the inn sign from where it leant against the pantomime cottage, and planted it like a pike in the ground beside him. Then he began to sing again, in an even louder voice than before. O Lord Ivywood may lop, and his privilege is sylvan and riparian, and is also free to top, but... Do you know, said Hump, also finishing his lunch, that I'm rather tired of that particular tune? Tired, is it? Said the indignant Irishman. Then I'll sing you a longer song, to an even worse tune, about more and more vegetarians, and you shall see me dance as well, and I shall dance till you burst into tears and offer me the half of your kingdom. And I shall ask for Mr. Levison's head on the frying pan. For this, let me tell you, is a song of Oriental origin, celebrating the caprices of an ancient Babylonian sultan, and should be performed in palaces of ivory, with palm trees and a bulbul accompaniment. And he began to bellow another and older lyric of his own on vegetarianism. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Jews, suffered from new and original views. He crawled on his hands and knees, it said, with grass in his mouth and a crown on his head, with a wow tayidly, etc. Those in traditional paths that trod thought the thing was a curse from God, but a pioneer men always abuse, like Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Jews. Dalroy, as he sang this, actually began to dance about like a ballet girl, an enormous and ridiculous figure in the sunlight, waving the wooden sign around his head. Quoodle opened his eyes and pricked up his ears, and seemed much interested in these extraordinary evolutions. Suddenly, with one of those startling changes that will transfigure the most sedentary dogs, Quoodle decided that the dance was a game, and began to bark and bound round the performer, sometimes leaping so far into the air as almost to threaten the man's throat. But, though the sailor naturally knew less about dogs than the countryman, he knew enough about them, as about many other things, not to be afraid, and the voice he sang with might have drowned out the baying of a pack. Black Lord Foulon the Frenchman slew, thought it a futurist thing to do. He offered them grass instead of bread, so they stuffed him with grass when they cut off his head, with a wow tiredly, etc. For the pride of his soul he perished then, but of course it is always the pride that men, a man in advance of his age accuse, like Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Jews. Simeon Scudder of Styx in Maine thought of the thing and was at it again. He gave good grass and water in pails to 1,000 Irishmen hammering rails, with a wow tiredly, etc. Appetites differ, and tied to a stake, he was tarred and feathered for conscience' sake. But stoning the prophets is ancient news, like Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Jews. In an abandon, unusual even for him, he had danced his way down through the thistles into the jungle of weeds risen round the sunken chapel. And the dog, now fully convinced that it was not only a game, but an expedition, perhaps a hunting expedition, ran barking in front of him along the path that his own dog's paws had already burst through the tangle. Before Patrick Dalroy well knew what he was doing, or even remembered that he still carried the ridiculous signboard in his hand, he found himself outside the open porch of a sort of narrow tower at the angle of a building which, to the best of his recollection, he had never seen before. Quoodle instantly ran up 4 or 5 steps in the dark staircase inside, and then, lifting his ears again, looked back for his companion. There is, perhaps, such a thing as asking too much of a man. If there is, it was asking too much of Patrick Dalroy to ask him not to accept so eccentric an invitation. Hurriedly plunging his unwieldy wooden ensign upright in the thick of thistles and grass, he bent his gigantic neck and shoulders to enter the porch, and proceeded to climb the stairs. It was quite dark, and it was only after at least 2 twists of the stone spiral that he saw light ahead of him, and then it was a sort of rent in the wall that seemed to him as ragged as the mouth of a Cornish cave. It was also so low that he had some difficulty in squeezing his bulk through it, but the dog had jumped through with an air of familiarity, and once more looked back to see him follow. If he had found himself inside any ordinary domestic interior, he would instantly have repented his escapade and gone back. But he found himself in surroundings which he had never seen before, or even, in one sense, believed possible. His first feeling was that he was walking in the most sealed and secret suite of apartments in the castle of a dream. All the chambers had that air of perpetually opening inwards which is the soul of the Arabian Nights. And the ornament was of the same tradition, gorgeous and flamboyant, yet featureless and stiff. A purple mansion seemed to be built inside a green mansion, and a golden mansion inside that. And the quaintly cut doorways or fretted lattices all had wavy lines like a dancing sea, and for some reason, seasickness for all he knew, this gave him a feeling as if the place were beautiful but faintly evil, as if it were bored and twisted for the fallen palace of the Worm. But he had also another sensation which he could not analyze, for it reminded him of being a fly on the ceiling or the wall. Was it the hanging gardens of Babylon coming back to his imagination, or the castle east of the sun and west of the moon? Then he remembered that in some boyish illness he had stared at a rather Moorish sort of wallpaper, which was like rows and rows of brightly colored corridors, empty and going on forever. And he remembered that a fly was walking along one of the parallel lines, and it seemed to his childish fancy that the corridors were all dead in front of the fly, but all came to life as he passed. "By George!" he cried. "I wonder whether that's the real truth about East and West, that the gorgeous East offers everything needed for adventures except the man to enjoy them. It would explain the tradition of the Crusades uncommonly well. Perhaps that's what God meant by Europe and Asia. We dress the characters and they paint the scenery. Well, anyhow, 3 of the least Asiatic things in the world are lost in this endless Asiatic palace, a good dog, a straight sword, and an Irishman." But as he went down this telescope of tropical colors, he really felt something of that hard fatalistic freedom of the heroes, or should we say villains, in the Arabian Nights. He was prepared for any impossibility. He would hardly have been surprised if from under the lid of one of the porcelain pots standing in a corner had come a serpentine string of blue or yellow smoke, as if some wizard's oil were within. He would hardly have been surprised if from under the curtains or closed doors had crawled out a snaky track of blood, or if a dumb negro dressed in white had come out with a bowstring, having done his work. He would not have been surprised if he had walked suddenly into the still chamber of some sultan asleep whom to wake was a death in torments. And yet he was very much more surprised by what he did see, and when he saw it he was certain at last that he was only wandering in the labyrinth of his own brain, for what he saw was what was really in the core of all his dreams. What he saw, indeed, was more appropriate to that inmost eastern chamber than anything he had imagined. On a divan of blood-red and orange cushions lay a startlingly beautiful woman, with a skin almost swarthy enough for an Arab's, and who might well have been the princess proper to such an Arabian tale. But in truth it was not her appropriateness to the scene, but rather her inappropriateness, that made his heart bound. It was not her strangeness, but her familiarity, that made his big feet suddenly stop. The dog ran on yet more rapidly, and the princess on the sofa welcomed him warmly, lifting him on his short hind legs. Then she looked up and seemed turned to stone. "Bismillah," said the Oriental traveller affably. "May your shadow never grow less, or more, as the ladies would say. The Commander of the Faithful has deputed his least competent slave to bring you back a dog. Owing to temporary delay in collecting the 15 largest diamonds in the moon, he has been compelled to send the animal without any collar. Those responsible for the delay will instantly be beaten to death with the tails of dragons." The frightful shock, which had not yet left the lady's face, brought him back to responsible speech. "In short," he said, "in the name of the Prophet, dog. I say, Joan, I wish this wasn't a dream." "It isn't," said the girl, speaking for the first time, "and I don't know yet whether I wish it was." "Well," argued the dreamer, rationally, "what are you, any time, if you are not a dream, or a vision? And what are all these rooms, if they aren't a dream, or rather a nightmare?" "This is the new wing of Ivywood House," said the lady addressed as Joan, speaking with great difficulty. "Lord Ivywood has fitted them up in the Eastern style. He is inside, conducting a most interesting debate in defense of Eastern vegetarianism. I only came out because the room was rather hot." "Vegetarian!" cried Dalroy, with abrupt and rather unreasonable exasperation. "That table seems to fall a bit short of vegetarianism." And he pointed to one of the long, narrow tables laid somewhere in almost all the central rooms, and loaded with elaborate cold meats and expensive wines. "He must be liberal-minded," cried Joan, who seemed to be on the verge of something, possibly temper. "He can't expect people suddenly to begin being vegetarians when they've never been before." "It has been done," said Dalroy, tranquilly, walking across to look at the table. "I say, your ascetical friends seem to have made a pretty good hole in the champagne. You may not believe it, Joan, but I haven't touched what you call alcohol for a month." With which words he filled with champagne a large tumbler intended for claret cup, and swallowed it at a draught. Lady Joan Brett stood up straight but trembling. "Now, what's really wrong, Pat?" she cried. "Oh, don't be silly. You know I don't care about the alcohol or all that. But you're in the man's house, uninvited, and he doesn't know. That wasn't like you." "He shall know all right," said the large man quietly. "I know the exact price of a tumbler of that champagne." And he scribbled some words in pencil on the back of a bill of fare on the table, and then carefully laid 3 shillings on top of it. "And there you do Philip the worst wrong of all," cried Lady Joan, flaming white. "You know as well as I do, anyhow, that he would not take your money." Patrick Dalroy stood looking at her for some seconds with an expression on his broad and unusually open face which she found utterly puzzling. "Curiously enough," he observed at last, and with absolutely even temper, "curiously enough, it is you who are doing Philip Ivywood a wrong. I think him quite capable of breaking England or creation. But I do honestly think he would never break his word. And what is more, I think the more arbitrary and literal his word had been, the more he would keep it. You will never understand a man like that till you understand that he can have devotion to a definition, even a new definition. He can really feel about an amendment to an Act of Parliament, inserted at the last moment, as you feel about England or your mother." "Oh, don't philosophize," cried Joan suddenly. "Can't you see this has been a shock?" "I only want you to see the point," he replied. "Lord Ivywood clearly told me with his own careful lips that I might go in and pay for fermented liquor in any place displaying a public sign outside. and he won't go back on that definition, or on any definition. If he finds me here, he may quite possibly put me in prison on some other charge, as a thief or a vagabond, or what not. But he will not grudge me the champagne. And he will accept the 3 shillings, and I shall honor him for his glorious consistency." "I don't understand," said Joan, "one word of what you are talking about. Which way did you come? How can I get you away? You don't seem to grasp that you're in Ivywood House." "You see, there's a new name outside the gate," observed Patrick, conversationally, and led the lady to the end of the corridor by which he had entered and into its ultimate turret chamber. Following his indications, Lady Joan peered a little over the edge of the window where hung the brilliant purple bird in its brilliant golden cage. Almost immediately below, outside the entrance to the half-closed stairway, stood a wooden tavern sign, as solid and still as if it had been there for centuries. "All back at the sign of the Old Ship, you see," said the captain. "Can I offer you anything in a ladylike way?" There was a vast impudence in the slight, hospitable movement of his hand that disturbed Lady Joan's features with an emotion other than any she had desired to show. "Well," cried Patrick with wild geniality, "I've made you laugh again, my dear." He caught her to him as in a whirlwind, and then vanished from the fairy turret like a blast, leaving her standing with her hand up to her wild black hair. End of chapter 12. Of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 13. The Battle of the Tunnel. What Joan Brett really felt, as she went back from the second tete-a-tete she had experienced in the turret, it is doubtful if anyone will ever know. But she was full of the pungent feminine instinct to drive at practice, and what she did clearly realize was the pencil writing Dalroy had left on the back of Lord Ivywood's menu. Heaven alone knew what it was, and, as it pleased her profane temper to tell herself, she was not satisfied with heaven alone knowing. She went swiftly back, with swishing skirts, to the table where it had been left. But her skirts fell more softly and her feet trailed slower and more in her usual manner as she came near the table. For standing at it was Lord Ivywood, reading the card with tranquil lowered eyelids that set off perfectly the long and perfect oval of his face. He put down the card with a quite natural action, and, seeing Joan, smiled at her in his most sympathetic way. "So you've come out too," he said. "So have I. It's really too hot for anything. Dr. Gluck is making an uncommonly good speech, but I couldn't stop even for that. Don't you think my Eastern decorations are rather a success after all? A sort of vegetarianism in design, isn't it?" He led her up and down the corridors, pointing out lemon-colored crescents or crimson pomegranates in the scheme of ornament, with such utter detachment that they twice passed the open mouth of the Hall of Debate, and Joan could distinctly hear the voice of the diplomatic Gluck saying, "Indeed, we owe our knowledge of the pollution of the pork primarily to the Jewth and not the Moslems. I do not thare that prejudice against the Jewth which is too common in my family and all the aristocratic and military Prussian families. I think we Prussian aristocrats owe everything to the Jewth. The Jewth have given to our old Teutonic rugged virtues just that touch of refinement, just that intellectual superiority which—" And then the voice would die away behind as Lord Ivywood lectured luxuriantly, and very well, on the peacock tail in decoration, or some more extravagant Eastern version of the Greek key. But the third time they turned, they heard the noise of subdued applause and the breaking up the meeting, and people came pouring forth. With stillness and swiftness Ivywood pitched on the people he wanted and held them. He buttonholed Leveson, and was evidently asking him to do something which neither of the two liked doing. "If your lordship insists," she heard Leveson whispering, "of course I will go myself. But there is a great deal to be done here with your lordship's immediate matters. And if there were any one else—" If Philip, Lord Ivywood, had ever looked at a human being in his life, he would have seen that J. Leveson, secretary, was suffering from a very ancient human malady, excusable in all men, and rather more excusable in one who has had his top hat smashed over his eyes and has run for his life. As it was, he saw nothing, but merely said, "Oh, well, get someone else. What about your friend Hibbs?" Leveson ran across to Hibbs, who was drinking another glass of champagne at one of the innumerable buffets. "Hibbs," said Leveson, rather nervously, "will you do Lord Ivywood a favour? He says you have so much tact. It seems possible that a man may be hanging about the grounds just below that turret there. He is a man it would certainly be Lord Ivywood's public duty to put into the hands of the police, if he is there. But then again, he is quite capable of not being there at all. I mean of having sent his message from somewhere else and in some other way. Naturally, Lord Ivywood doesn't want to alarm the ladies and perhaps turn the laugh against himself by getting up a sort of police raid about nothing. He wants some sensible, tactful friend of his to go down and look around the place it's a sort of disused garden and report if there's anyone about. I'd go myself, but I'm wanted here." Hibbs nodded and filled another glass. "But there's a further difficulty," went on Leveson. "He's a clever brute, it seems, a remarkable and a dangerous man, were his lordship's words. And it looks as if he'd spotted a very good hiding place. A disused tunnel leading to the sands just beyond the disused garden and chapel. It's a smart choice, you see, for he can bolt into the woods if anyone comes from the shore, or onto the shore if anyone comes from the woods. But it would take a good time even to get the police here, and it would take 10 times longer to get 'em round to the sea end of the tunnel, especially as the sea comes up to the cliffs once or twice between here and Pebblewick. So we mustn't frighten him away or he'll get a start. If you meet anyone down there, talk to him quite naturally and come back with the news. We won't send for the police till you come. Talk as if you were just wandering like himself. His lordship wishes your presence to appear quite accidental." "Wishes my presence to appear quite accidental," repeated Hibbs gravely. When the feverish Leveson had flashed off satisfied, Hibbs took a glass or two more of wine, feeling that he was going on a great diplomatic mission to please a lord. Then he went through the opening, picked his way down the stair, and somehow found his way out into the neglected garden and shrubbery. It was already evening, and an early moon was brightening over the sunken chapel with its dragon-coloured scales of fungus. The night breeze was very fresh, and had a marked effect on Mr. Hibbs. He found himself taking a meaningless pleasure in the scene, especially in one fungus that was white with brown spots. He laughed shortly to think that it should be white with brown spots. Then he said, with carefully accurate articulation, "His lordship wishes my presence to appear quite accidental." Then he tried to remember something else that Leveson had said. He began to wade through the waves of weed and thorn past the chapel, but he found the soil much more uneven and obstructive than he had supposed. He slipped, and sought to save himself by throwing one arm round a broken stone angel at a corner of the heap of Gothic fragments, but it was loose and rocked in its socket. Mr. Hibbs presented for a moment the appearance of waltzing with the angel in the moonlight in a very amorous and irreverent manner. Then the statue rolled over one way and he rolled over the other, and lay on his face in the grass, making inaudible remarks. He might have lain there for some time, or at least found some difficulty in rising, but for another circumstance. The dog Quoodle, with characteristic officiousness, had followed him down the dark stairs and out of the doorway, and, finding him in this unusual posture, began to bark as if the house were on fire. This brought a heavy human footstep from the more hidden parts of the copse, and in a minute or two the large man with the red hair was looking down at him in undisguised wonder. Hibbs said, in a muffled voice which came obscurely from under his hidden face, "Wish my presence to appear quite accidental." "It does," said the captain. "Can I help you up? Are you hurt?" He gently set the prostrate gentleman on his feet and looked genuinely concerned. The fall had somewhat sobered Lord Ivywood's representative, and he really had a red graze on his left cheek that looked more ugly than it was. "I am so sorry," said Patrick Dalroy, cordially. "Come and sit down in our camp. My friend Pump will be back presently, and he's a capital doctor." His friend Pump may or may not have been a capital doctor, but the captain himself was certainly a most inefficient one. So small was his talent for diagnosing the nature of a disease at sight, that having given Mr. Hibbs a seat on a fallen tree by the tunnel, he proceeded to give him, in mere automatic hospitality, a glass of rum. Mr. Hibbs' eyes awoke again when he had sipped it, but they awoke to a new world. "Wharever may be our invidual 'pinions," he said, and looked into space with an expression of humorous sagacity. He then put his hand lazily in his pocket as if to find some letter he had to deliver. He found nothing but his old journalistic notebook, which he had often carried when there was a chance of interviewing anybody. The feel of it under his fingers changed the whole attitude of his mind. He took it out and said, "And what would you say of vegetarianism, Colonel Pump?" "I think it palls," replied the recipient of this complex title, staring. "Shall we say," asked Hibbs brightly, turning a leaf in his notebook, "shall we say long been strong vegetarian by conviction?" "No, I have only once been convicted," answered Dalroy with restraint, "and I hope to lead a better life when I come out." "Hopes lead better life," murmured Hibbs, writing eagerly, with the wrong end of his pencil. "And what would you shay was best vegetable food for really strong vegetarian by conviction?" "Thistles," said the captain warily, "but I don't know much about it, you know." "Lord Ivy was strong vegetarian by conviction," said Mr. Hibbs, shaking his head with unction. "Lord Ivywood says tact. Talk to him naturally. And so I do. That's what I do. Talk to him naturally." Humphrey Pump came through the clearer part of the wood, leading the donkey, who had just partaken of the diet recommended to a vegetarian by conviction. The dog sprang up and ran to them. Pump was, perhaps, the most naturally polite man in the world, and said nothing. But his eyes had accepted, with one snap of surprise, the other fact, also not unconnected with diet, which had escaped Dalroy's notice when he administered rum as a restorative. "Lord Ivywood says," murmured the journalistic diplomatist, "Lord Ivywood says, talk as if you were just wandering. That's it. That's tact. That's what I've got to do. Talk as if I was just wandering. Long way round to other end tunnel. Sea and cliffs. Don't s'pose they can swim." He seized his notebook again and looked in vain for his pencil. "Good subject correspondence. Can policemen swim?" "Policemen?" said Dalroy in a dead silence. The dog looked up and the innkeeper did not. "Get to Ivywood one thing," reasoned the diplomatist. "Get policemen beach other end other thing. No good do one thing, not do other thing. No good do other thing, not do other thing. Wish my presence appear quite accidental. Ha!" "I'll harness the donkey," said Pump. "Will he go through that door?" asked Dalroy, with a gesture toward the entrance of the rough boarding with which they had faced the tunnel. "Or shall I smash it all at once?" "He'll go through all right," answered Pump. "I saw to that when I made it. And I think I'll get him to the safe end of the tunnel before I load him up. The best thing you can do is pull up one of those saplings to bar the door with. That'll delay 'em a minute or two." though I think we've got warning in pretty easy time." He led his donkey to the cart and carefully harnessed the donkey. Like all men cunning in the old healthy sense, he knew that the last chance of leisure ought to be leisurely, in order that it may be lucid. Then he led the whole equipment through the temporary wooden door of the tunnel, the inquisitive Quoodle, of course, following at his heels. "Excuse me if I take a tree," said Dalroy politely to his guest, like a man reaching across another man for a match. And with that he rent up a young tree by its roots, as he had done on the Island of the Olives, and carried it on his shoulder like the club of Hercules. Up in Ivywood House, Lord Ivywood had telephoned twice to Pebblewick. It was a delay he seldom suffered, and, though he never experienced impatience in unnecessary words, he expressed it in unnecessary walking. He would not yet send for the police without news from his ambassador, but he thought a preliminary conversation with some police authorities he knew well might advance matters. Seeing Leveson rather shrunk in a corner, he wheeled round in his walk and said abruptly, "You must go and see what has happened to Hibbs. If you have any other duties here, I authorize you to neglect them. Otherwise I can only say—" At this moment the telephone rang, and the impatient nobleman rushed for his delayed call with a rapidity he seldom showed. There was simply nothing for Leveson to do except to do as he was told, or be sacked. He walked swiftly toward the staircase, and only stopped once at the table where Hibbs had stood and gulped down 2 goblets of the same wine. But let no man attribute to Mr. Leveson the loose and luxurious social motives of Mr. Hibbs. Mr. Leveson did not drink for pleasure. In fact, he hardly knew what he was drinking. His motive was something far more simple and sincere, a sentiment forcibly described in legal phraseology as going in bodily fear. He was partly nerved, but by no means reconciled to his adventure, when he crept carefully down the stairs and peered about the thicket for any signs of his diplomatic friend. He could find neither distant sight nor sound to guide him, except a sort of distant singing, which greatly increased in volume of sound as he pursued it. The first words he heard seemed to run something like, "No more the milk of cows shall pollute my private house, than the milk of the wild mares of the barbarian. I shall stick to port and sherry, for they are so very, very vegetarian." Leveson did not know the huge and horrible voice in which these words were shouted, but he had a most strange and even sickening suspicion that he did know the voice, however altered, the quavering and rather refined voice that joined in the chorus and sang, "Because they are so vegetarian." Terror lit up his wits, and he made a wild guess at what had happened. With a gasp of relief he realized that he had now good excuse for returning to the house with the warning. He ran there like a hare, still hearing the great voice from the woods like the roaring of a lion in his ear. He found Lord Ivywood in consultation with Dr. Gluck, and also with Mr. Bullrose the agent, whose frog-like eyes hardly seemed to have recovered yet from the fairy tale of the flying signboard in the English lane, but who, to do him justice, was more plucky and practical than most of Lord Ivywood's present advisers. "I'm afraid Mr. Hibbs has inadvertently," stammered Leveson. I'm afraid the man is making his escape, my lord. You had better send for the police." Ivywood turned to the agent. "You go and see what's happening," he said simply. "I will come myself when I've rung them up. And get some of the servants up with sticks and things. Fortunately, the ladies have gone to bed. Hullo, is that the police station?" Bullrose went down into the shrubbery and had, for many reasons, less difficulty in crossing it than the hilarious Hibbs. The moon had increased to an almost unnatural brilliancy, so that the whole scene was like a rather silver daylight, and in this clear medium he beheld a very tall man with erect red hair and a colossal cylinder of cheese carried under one arm, while he employed the other to wag a big forefinger at a dog with whom he was conversing. It was the agent's duty and desire to hold the man, whom he recognized from the signboard mystery, in play and conversation, and prevent his final escape. But there are some people who really cannot be courteous, even when they want to be, and Mr. Bullrose was one of them. "Lord Ivywood," he said abruptly, "wants to know what you want." "Do not, however, fall into the common error, Quoodle," Dalroy was saying to the dog, whose unfathomable eyes were fixed on his face, "of supposing that the phrase 'good dog' is used in its absolute sense. A dog is good or bad negatively to a limited scheme of duties created by human civilization." "What are you doing here?" said Mr. Bullrose. "A dog, my dear Quoodle," continued the captain, "cannot be either so good or so bad as a man. Nay, I should go farther. I would almost say a dog cannot be so stupid as a man. He cannot be utterly wanting as a dog, as some men are as men." "Answer me, you there!" roared the agent. "It is all the more pathetic," continued the captain, to whose monologue Quoodle seemed to listen with magnetized attention. "It is all the more pathetic because this mental insufficiency is sometimes found in the good, though there are, I should imagine, at least an equal number of opposite examples. The person standing a few feet off us, for example, is both stupid and wicked. But be very careful, Quoodle, to remember that any disadvantage under which we place him should be based on the moral and not his mental defects. Should I say to you at any time, 'Go for him, Quoodle,' or 'Hold him, Quoodle,' be certain in your own mind, please, that it is solely because he is wicked and not because he is stupid that I am entitled to do so. The fact that he is stupid should not justify me in saying, 'Hold him, Quoodle,' with the realistic intonation I now employ." "Curse you, call him off!" cried Mr. Bullrose, retreating, for Quoodle was coming toward him with the bulldog part of his pedigree very prominently displayed like a pennon. "Should Mr. Bullrose find it expedient to climb a tree or even a signpost," proceeded Dalroy, for indeed the agent had already clasped the pole of the old ship, which was stouter than the slender trees standing just around it, "you will keep an eye on him, Quoodle, and, I doubt not, constantly remind him that it is his wickedness, and not, as he might hastily be inclined to suppose, stupidity, that has placed him on so conspicuous an elevation." "Some of you'll wish yourself dead for this," said the agent, who was by this time clinging to the wooden sign like a monkey on a stick, while Quoodle watched him from below with an unsated interest. "Some of you'll see something. Here comes his lordship and the police, I reckon." "Good morning, my lord," said Dalroy, as Ivywood, paler than ever in the strong moonshine, came through the thicket toward them. It seemed to be his fate that his faultless and hueless face should always be contrasted with richer colors, for even now it was thrown up by the gorgeous diplomatic uniform of Dr. Gluck, who walked just behind him. "I'm glad to see you, my lord," said Dalroy, in a stately manner. "It is always so awkward doing business with an agent, especially for the agent." "Captain Dalroy," said Lord Ivywood, with a more serious dignity, "I am sorry we meet again like this, and such things are not of my seeking. It is only right to tell you that the police will be here in a moment." "Quite time, too," said Dalroy, shaking his head. "I never saw anything so disgraceful in my life. Of course, I am sorry it's a friend of yours, and I hope the police will keep Ivywood House out of the papers. But I won't be a party to one law for the rich and another for the poor, and it would be a great shame if a man in that state got off altogether merely because he had got the stuff at your house." "I do not understand you," said Lord Ivywood. "What are you talking of?" "Why, of him," replied the captain with a genial gesture toward a fallen tree trunk that lay a yard or two from the tunnel wall. The poor chap the police are coming for." Lord Ivywood looked at the forest log by the tunnel which he had not glanced at before, and in his pale eyes, perhaps for the first time, stood a simple astonishment. Above the log appeared two duplicate objects, which, after a prolonged stare, he identified as the soles of a pair of patent leather shoes, offered to his gaze, as if demanding his opinion in the matter of re-soling. They were all that was visible of Mr. Hibbs, who had fallen backward off his woodland seat, and seemed contented with his new situation. His lordship put up the pince nez that made him look 10 years older, and said with a sharp, steely accent, "What is all this?" The only effect of his voice upon the faithful Hibbs was to cause him to feebly wave his legs in the air in recognition of a feudal superior. He clearly considered it hopeless to attempt to get up, so Dalroy, striding across to him, lugged him up by his shirt collar and exhibited him, limp and wild-eyed, to the company. "You won't want many policemen to take him to the station," said the captain. "I'm sorry, Lord Ivywood. I'm afraid it's no use your asking me to overlook it again. We can't afford it." And he shook his head implacably. "We've always kept a respectable house, Mr. Pump and I. The old ship has a reputation all over the country, in quite a lot of different parts, in fact. People in the oddest places have found it a quiet family house. Nothing gadabout in the old ship. And if you think you can send all your staggering revellers—" "Captain Dalroy," said Ivywood, simply, "you seem to be under a misapprehension, which I think it would be hardly honourable to leave undisturbed. Whatever these extraordinary events may mean, and whatever be fitting for the case of this gentleman, when I spoke of the police coming, I meant they were coming for you and your confederate." "For me?" cried the captain, with a stupendous air of surprise. "Why, I have never done anything naughty in my life." "You have been selling alcohol contrary to clause 5 of the Act of—" "But I've got a sign," cried Dalroy, excitedly. "You told me yourself it was all right if I'd got a sign. Oh, do look at our new sign. The sign of the Agile Agent." Mr. Bullrose had remained silent, feeling his position none of the most dignified, and hoping his employer would go away. But Lord Ivywood looked up at him, and thought he had wandered into a planet of monsters. As he slowly recovered himself, Patrick Dalroy said briskly, "All quite correct and conventional, you see. You can't run us in for not having a sign. We've rather an extra lifelike one. And you can't run us in as rogues and vagabonds either. Visible means of subsistence," and he slapped the huge cheese under his arm with his great flat hand, so that it reverberated like a drum. "Quite visible. Perceptible," he added, holding it out suddenly almost under Lord Ivywood's nose. "Perceptible to the naked eye through your lordship's eyeglasses." He turned abruptly, burst open the pantomime door behind him, and bowled the big cheese down the tunnel with a noise like thunder, which ended in a cry of acceptation in the distant voice of Mr. Humphrey Pump. It was the last of their belongings left at this end of the tunnel, and Dalroy turned again, a man totally transfigured. "And now, Ivywood," he said, "what can I be charged with? Well, I have a suggestion to make. I will surrender to the police quite quietly when they come, if you will do me one favour. Let me choose my crime." "I don't understand you," answered the other coolly. "What crime? What favour?" Captain Dalroy unsheathed the straight sword that still hung on his now shabby uniform. The slender blade sparkled pleasantly in the moonlight as he pointed it straight at Dr. Gluck. "Take away his sword from the little pawnbroker," he said. "It's about the length of mine. Or we'll change if you like. Give me 10 minutes on that strip of turf. And then it may be, Ivywood, that I shall be removed from your public path in a way a little worthier of enemies who have once been friends, than if you tripped me up with Bow Street runners, of whose help every ancestor you have would have been ashamed. Or, on the other hand, it may be, that when the police come there will be something to arrest me for." There was a long silence, and the elf of irresponsibility peeped out again for an instant in Dalroy's mind. "Mr. Bullrose will see fair play for you from a throne above the lists," he said. "I have already put my honour in the hands of Mr. Hibbs." "I must decline Captain Dalroy's invitation," said Ivywood at last in a curious tone. "Not so much because—" Before he could proceed, Leveson came racing across the copse, hallooing, "The police are here!" Dalroy, who loved leaving everything to the last instant, tore up the sign, with Bullrose literally hanging to it, shook him off like a ripe fruit, and then plunged into the tunnel, the clamorous Quoodle at his heels. Before even Ivywood, the promptest of his party, could reach the spot, he had clashed to the wood door and bolted it across with his wooden staple. He had not had time even to sheath his sword. "Break down this door," said Lord Ivywood calmly. "I noticed they haven't finished loading their cart." Under his directions, and vastly against their will, Bullrose and Leveson lifted the tree trunk vacated by Hibbs, and swinging it thrice as a battering ram, burst in the door. Lord Ivywood instantly sprang into the entrance. A voice called out to him quietly from the other end of the tunnel. There was something touching and yet terrible about a voice so human coming out of that inhuman darkness. If Philip Ivywood had been really a poet, and not rather its opposite, an aesthete, he would have known that all the past and people of England were uttering their oracle out of the cavern. As it was, he only heard a publican wanted by the police. Yet even he paused, and indeed seemed spellbound. "My lord, I would like a word. I learned my catechism and never was with the radicals. I want you to look at what you've done to me. You've stolen a house that was mine as that one's yours. You've made me a dirty tramp that was a man respected in church and market. Now you send me where I might have cells or the cat. If I might make so bold, what do you suppose I think of you? Do you think because you go up to London and settle it with the Lords in Parliament and bring back a lot of papers and long words, that makes any difference to the man you do it to? By what I can see, you're just a bad and cruel master, like those God punished in the old days, like Squire Varney the weasels killed in Holy Wood. Well, parson always said one might shoot at robbers, and I want to tell your lordship," he ended respectfully, "that I have a gun." Ivywood instantly stepped into the darkness and spoke in a voice shaken with some emotion, the nature of which was never certainly known. "The police are here," he said, "but I'll arrest you myself." A shot shrieked and rattled through the thousand echoes of the tunnel. Lord Ivywood's legs doubled and twisted under him, and he collapsed on the earth with a bullet above his knee. Almost at the same instant a shout and a bark announced that the cart had started as a complete equipage. It was even more than complete, for the instant before it moved Mr. Quoodle had sprung into it, and as it was driven off, sat erect in it, looking solemn. Chapter 13.
Of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 14. The Creature That Man Forgets. Despite the natural hubbub round the wound of Lord Ivywood, and the difficulties of the police in finding their way to the shore, the fugitives of the Flying Inn must almost certainly have been captured but for a curious accident, which also flowed, as it happened, from the great Ivywood debate on vegetarianism. The comparatively late hour at which Lord Ivywood had made his discovery had been largely due to a very long speech which Joan had not heard, and which was delivered immediately before the few concluding observations she had heard from Dr. Gluck. The speech was made by an eccentric, of course. Most of those who attended, and nearly all of those who talked, were eccentric in one way or another. but he was an eccentric of great wealth and good family, an M.P., a J.P., a relation of Lady Enid, a man well known in art and letters; in short, a personality who could not be prevented from being anything he chose, from a revolutionist to a bore. Dorian Wimpole had first become famous outside his own class under the fanciful title of the Poet of the Birds. A volume of verse, expanding the several notes or cries of separate song-birds into fantastic soliloquies of these feathered philosophers, had really contained a great deal of ingenuity and elegance. Unfortunately, he was one of those who always tend to take their own fancies seriously, in whose otherwise legitimate extravagance there is too little of the juice of jest. Hence, in his later works, when he explained the fable of the angel, by trying to prove that the fowls of the air were creatures higher than man or the anthropoids, his manner was felt to be too austere; and when he moved an amendment to Lord Ivywood's scheme for the model village called Peaceways, urging that its houses should all follow the more hygienic architecture of nests hung in trees, many regretted that he had lost his light touch. But when he went beyond birds and filled his poems with conjectural psychology about all the zoological gardens, his meaning became obscure, and Lady Susan had even described it as his "bad period." It was all the more uncomfortable reading because he poured forth the imaginary hymns, love songs, and war songs of the lower animals without a word of previous explanation. Thus, if someone seeking for an ordinary drawing-room song came on lines that were headed "A Desert Love Song," in which began, "Her head is high against the stars, her hump is heaved in pride," the compliment to the lady would at first seem startling, until the reader realized that all the characters in the idyll were camels. Or, if he began a poem simply entitled "The March of Democracy," and found in the first lines, "Comrades, marching evermore, fix your teeth in floor and door," he might be doubtful about such a policy for the masses, until he discovered that it was supposed to be addressed by an eloquent and aspiring rat to the social solidarity of his race. Lord Ivywood had nearly quarrelled with his poetic relative over the uproarious realism of the verses called "A Drinking Song," until it was carefully explained to him that the drink was water, and that the festive company consisted of bisons. His vision of the perfect husband, as it exists in the feelings of the young female walrus, is thoughtful and suggestive, but would doubtless receive many emendations from anyone who had experienced those feelings. And in his sonnet called "Motherhood," he has made the young scorpion consistent and convincing, yet somehow not wholly lovable. In justice to him, however, it should be remembered that he attacked the most difficult cases on principle, declaring that there was no earthly creature that a poet should forget. He was of the blonde type of his cousin, with flowing fair hair and mustache and a bright blue absent-minded eye. He was very well dressed in the carefully careless manner, with a brown velvet jacket and the image on his ring of one of those beasts men worshipped in Egypt. His speech was graceful and well-worded and enormously long, and it was all about an oyster. He passionately protested against the suggestion of some humanitarians who were vegetarians in other respects, but maintained that organisms so simple might fairly be counted as exceptions. Man, he said, even at his miserable best, was always trying to excommunicate some one citizen of the cosmos, to forget some one creature that he should remember. Now, it seemed that creature was the oyster. He gave a long account of the tragedy of the oyster, a really imaginative and picturesque account, full of fantastic fishes and coral crags crawling and climbing, and bearded creatures streaking the seashore in the green darkness in the cellars of the sea. "What a horrid irony it is," he cried, "that this is the only one of the lower creatures whom we call a native. We speak of him, and of him alone, as if he were a native of the country, whereas indeed he is an exile in the universe. What can be conceived more pitiful than the eternal frenzy of the impotent amphibian? What is more terrible than the tear of an oyster? Nature herself has sealed it with the hard seal of eternity. The creature man forgets bears against him a testimony that cannot be forgotten. For the tears of widows and of captives are wiped away at last like the tears of children. They vanish like the mists of morning or the small pools after a flood. But the tear of the oyster is a pearl." The Poet of the Birds was so excited with his own speech that, after the meeting, he walked out with a wild eye to the motor car, which had been long awaiting him, the chauffeur giving some faint signs of relief. "Toward home, for the present," said the poet, and stared at the moon with an inspired face. He was very fond of motoring, finding it fed him with inspirations, and he had been doing it from an early hour that morning, having enjoyed a slightly lessened sleep. He had scarcely spoken to anybody until he spoke to the cultured crowd at Ivywood. He did not wish to speak to anyone for many hours yet. His ideas were racing. He had thrown on a fur coat over his velvet jacket, but he let it fly open, having long forgotten the coldness and the splendor of the moonstruck night. He realized only two things, the swiftness of his car and the swiftness of his thoughts. He felt, as it were, a fury of omniscience. He seemed flying, with every bird that sped or spun above the woods, with every squirrel that had leapt and tumbled within them, with every tree that had swung under and sustained the blast. Yet in a few moments he leaned forward and tapped the glass frontage of the car, and the chauffeur, suddenly squaring his shoulders, jarringly stopped the wheels. Dorian Wimpole had just seen something in the clear moonlight by the roadside which appealed both to this and to the other side of his tradition, something that appealed to Wimpole as well as to Dorian. Two shabby-looking men, one in tattered gaiters and the other in what looked like the remains of fancy dress with the addition of hair, of so wild a red that it looked like a wig, were halted under the hedge, apparently loading a donkey-cart. At least two rounded, rudely cylindrical objects, looking more or less like tubs, stood out in the road beside the wheels, along with a sort of loose wooden post that lay along the road beside them. As a matter of fact, the man in the old gaiters had just been feeding and watering the donkey, and was now adjusting its harness more easily. But Dorian Wimpole naturally did not expect that sort of thing from that sort of man. There swelled up in him the sense that his omnipotence went beyond the poetical, that he was a gentleman, a magistrate, an MP, and J.P., and so on. This callousness or ignorance about animals should not go on while he was a J.P., especially since Ivywood's last act. He simply strode across to the stationary cart and said, "You are overloading that animal, and it is forfeited, and you must come with me to the police station." Humphrey Pump, who was very considerate to animals, and had always tried to be considerate to gentlemen, in spite of having put a bullet into one of their legs, was simply too astounded and distressed to make any answer at all. He moved a step or two backward, and stared with brown, blinking eyes at the poet, the donkey, the cask, the cheese, and the signboard laying in the road. But Captain Dalroy, with the quicker recovery of his national temperament, swept the poet and magistrate a vast, fantastic bow, and said with agreeable impudence, "Interested in donkeys, no doubt?" "I am interested in all things men forget," answered the poet with a fine touch of pride, "but mostly in those like this, that are most easily forgotten." Somehow, from those two first sentences, Pump realized that these two eccentric aristocrats had unconsciously recognized each other. The fact that it was unconscious seemed, somehow, to exclude him all the more. He stirred a little the moonlit dust of the road with his rather dilapidated boots, and eventually strolled across to speak to the chauffeur. "Is the next police station far from here?" he asked. The chauffeur answered with one syllable of which the nearest literal rendering is "dunno." Other spellings have been attempted, but the sentiment expressed is that of agnosticism. But something of special brutality of abbreviation made the shrewd and therefore sensitive Mr. Pump look at the man's face, and he saw it was not only the moonlight that made it white. With that dumb delicacy that was so English in him, Pump looked at the man again, and saw he was leaning heavily on the car with one arm, and saw that the arm was shaking. He understood his countrymen enough to know that whatever he said he must say in a careless manner. "I hope it's nearer to your place, you must be a bit done up." "Oh, hell!" said the driver, and spat on the road. Pump was sympathetically silent, and Mr. Wimpole's chauffeur broke out incoherently, as if in another place. "Blarsted beauties of the break and no breakfast. Blarsted lunch Heavywood and no lunch. Blasted black everlasting hours outside where he is a sykin' champagne, and then it's a donkey." "You don't mean to say," said Pump in a very serious voice, "that you've had no food today?" "Oh, no," replied the Cockney, with the irony of the deathbed. "Oh, of course not." Pump strolled back into the road again, picked up the cheese in his left hand, and landed it on the seat beside the driver. Then his right hand went to one of his large, loose, equivocal pockets, and the blade of a big jackknife caught and recaught the steady splendors of the moon. The driver stared for several instants at the cheese, with the knife shaking in his hand. Then he began to hack it, and in that white, witch-like light, the happiness of his face was almost horrible. Pump was wise in all such things, and knew that just as a little food will sometimes prevent sheer intoxication, so a little stimulant will sometimes prevent sudden and dangerous indigestion. It was practically impossible to make the man stop eating cheese. It was far better to give him a very little of the rum, especially as it was a very good rum, and better than anything he could find in any of the public houses that were still permitted. He walked across the road again and picked up the small cask which he put on the other side of the cheese, and from which he filled, in his own manner, the little cup he carried in his pocket. But at the sight of this, the Cockney's eyes lit up at once with terror and desire. "But you can't do it," he whispered hoarsely. "It's the police. It's gaol for that, with no doctor's letter nor signboard nor nothing." Mr. Humphrey Pump made yet another march back into the road. When he got there he hesitated for the first time, but it was quite clear from the attitude of the two insane aristocrats who were arguing and posturing in the road that they would notice nothing except each other. He picked the loose post off the road and brought it to the car, humorously propping it erect in the aperture between keg and cheese. The little glass of rum was wavering in the poor chauffeur's hand exactly as the big knife had done, but when he looked up and actually saw the wooden sign above him, he seemed not so much to pluck up his courage, but rather to drag up some forgotten courage from the foundations of some unfathomable sea. It was indeed the forgotten courage of the people. He looked once at the bleak, black pine woods around him, and took the mouthful of golden liquid at a gulp as if it were a fairy potion. He sat silent, and then, very slowly, a sort of stony glitter began to come into his eyes. The brown and vigilant eyes of Humphrey Pump were studying him with some anxiety or even fear. He did look rather like a man enchanted or turned to stone, but he spoke very suddenly. "The blighter!" he said. "I'll give him hell! I'll give him bleeding hell! I'll give him something what he don't expect!" "What do you mean?" asked the innkeeper. "Why," answered the chauffeur with abrupt composure, "I'll give him a little donkey." Mr. Pump looked troubled. "Do you think," he observed, affecting to speak lightly, "that he's fit to be trusted even with a little donkey?" "Oh, yes," said the man. "He's very amiable with donkeys, and donkeys we is to be amiable with them." Pump still looked at him doubtfully, appearing or affecting not to follow his meaning. Then he looked equally anxious across at the other two men, but they were still talking. Different as they were in every other way, they were of the sort who forget everything, class, quarrel, time, place and physical facts in front of them, in the lust of lucid explanation and equal argument. Thus, when the captain began by lightly alluding to the fact that after all it was his donkey, since he had bought it from a tinker for a just price, the police station practically vanished from Wimpole's mind, and I fear the donkey cart also. Nothing remained but the necessity of dissipating the superstition of personal property. "I own nothing," said the poet, waving his hands outward. "I own nothing save in the sense that I own everything, and all depends whether wealth or power be used for or against the higher purposes of the cosmos." "Indeed," replied Dalroy. "And how does your motor car serve the higher purposes of the cosmos?" "It helps me," said Mr. Wimpole with honorable simplicity, "to produce my poems." "And if it could be used for some higher purpose, if such a thing could be, if some new purpose had come into the cosmos's head by accident," inquired the other, "I suppose it would cease to be your property." "Certainly," replied the dignified Dorian. "I should not complain, nor have you any title to complain when the donkey ceases to be yours when you depress it in the cosmic scale." "What makes you think," asked Dalroy, "that I wanted to depress it?" "It is my firm belief," replied Dorian Wimpole sternly, "that you wanted to ride on it." For indeed the captain had once repeated his playful gesture of putting his large leg across. "Is not that so?" "No," answered the captain innocently. "I never ride on a donkey. I'm afraid of it." "Afraid of a donkey!" cried Wimpole incredulously. "Afraid of an historical comparison," said Dalroy. There was a short pause, and Wimpole said coolly enough, "Oh, well, we've outlived those comparisons." "Easily," answered the Irish captain. "It is wonderful how easily one outlives someone else's crucifixion." "In this case," said the other grimly, "I think it is the donkey's crucifixion." "Why, you must have drawn that old Roman caricature of the crucified donkey," said Patrick Dalroy with an air of some wonder. "How well you have worn! Why, you look so young! Well, of course, if this donkey is crucified he must be uncrucified, but are you quite sure," he added very gravely, "that you know how to uncrucify a donkey? I assure you it's one of the rarest of human arts. All a matter of knack. It's like the doctors with the rare diseases, you know. The necessity so seldom arises. Granted that, by the higher purposes of the cosmos, I am unfit to look after this donkey, I must still feel a faint shiver of responsibility in passing him on to you. Will you understand this donkey? He is a delicate-minded donkey. He is a complex donkey. How can I be certain that, on so short an acquaintance, you will understand every shade of his little likes and dislikes?" The dog Quoodle, who had been sitting as still as the Sphinx under the shadow of the pine trees, waddled out for an instant into the middle of the road and then returned. He ran out when a slight noise as of rotary grinding was heard, and ran back when it had ceased, but Dorian Wimpole was much too keen on his philosophical discovery to notice either dog or wheel. "I shall not sit on its back anyhow," he said proudly. "But if that were all it would be a small matter. It is enough for you that you have left it in the hands of the only person who could really understand it, one who searches the skies and seas so as not to neglect the smallest creature." "This is a very curious creature," said the captain, anxiously. "He has all sorts of odd antipathies. He can't stand a motor car, for instance, especially one that throbs like that while it's standing still. He doesn't mind a fur coat so much, but if you wear a brown velvet jacket under it he bites you. And you must keep him out of the way of a certain kind of people. I don't suppose you've met them, but they always think that anybody with less than 200 a year is drunk and very cruel, and that anybody with more than 2,000 a year is conducting the day of judgment. If you will keep our dear donkey from the society of such persons—" "Hullo! Hullo! Hullo!" He turned in genuine disturbance and dashed after the dog, who had dashed after the motor car and jumped inside. The captain jumped in after the dog, to pull him out again, but before he could do so he found the car was flying along too fast for any such leap. He looked up and saw the sign of the Old Ship erect in the front like a rigid banner, and Pump with his cask and cheese sitting solidly beside the driver. The thing was more of an earthquake and transformation to him even than to any of the others, but he rose waveringly to his feet and shouted out to Wimpole, "You've left it in the right hands. I've never been cruel to a motor." In the moonlight of the magic pine wood far behind, Dorian and the donkey were left looking at each other. To the mystical mind, when it is a mind at all, which is by no means always the case, there are no two things more impressive and symbolical than a poet and a donkey. And the donkey was a very gentle donkey, and the poet was a very gentle poet, however lawfully he might be mistaken for the other animal at times. The interest of the donkey and the poet will never be known. The interest of the poet in the donkey was perfectly genuine, and survived even that appalling private interview in the owlish secrecy of the woods. But I think even the poet would have been enlightened if he had seen the white, set, frantic face of the man on the driver's seat of his vanishing motor. If he had seen it he might have remembered the name, or perhaps even begun to understand the nature of a certain animal which is neither the donkey nor the oyster, but the creature whom man has always found it easiest to forget, since the hour he forgot God in a garden. End of chapter 14.